Berlin, May 1st, 1945. The night is torn open by thunder that isn't weather. Soviet artillery pounds the horizon. Each shell lands closer, shaking the cracked walls of the Reich Chancellery. In the darkness of a half-collapsed communications room, a lone German radio operator adjusts the dials with trembling hands. His uniform is coated in dust and ash. The light bulb above flickers, swinging gently like a pendulum of fate. Static fills the air, then a voice. Weak, distorted. Somewhere far away, another operator is asking for status. The man hesitates, swallows hard, and presses the transmitter. His voice is calm but hollow. Fein in der Stadt. They're already in the city. Silence follows. Only the hum of dying equipment remains. Outside, the rumble of T-34 tanks echoes through the streets. Berlin is burning, from the government district to the Spree. Above the ruins, the red flag waits to rise. The transmission crackles one last time, then fades into static. The war in Europe is breathing its final moments, through a broken radio buried beneath a collapsing empire. By the spring of 1945, the German Reich was no longer a nation, it was a battlefield. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had stormed across Europe in 1939 and 1940 with unmatched precision, now fought a desperate, crumbling retreat on every front. From the west, the Allied armies, American, British, Canadian, and French, had crossed the Rhine. From the east, the Red Army thundered toward Berlin, relentless and vast. The balance that once defined Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had disintegrated in less than 6 years. In the ruins of what was once his empire, there remained only chaos, hunger, and denial. By January 1945, the Soviets had already launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, one of the most devastating offensives in modern history. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front surged west from Poland, crushing German resistance and capturing Warsaw. In just 23 days, the Red Army advanced over 300 miles, reaching the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin itself. The German army, depleted and disorganized, could do little more than delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, in the west, Operation Lumberjack and Operation Plunder brought Allied forces across the Rhine. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's armies rolled into the German heartland, liberating towns and uncovering the horror of the concentration camps. Germany was surrounded on all sides, encircled by the consequences of its own aggression. Inside Germany, reality was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins. Industrial power plants stood silent. Rail lines were bombed beyond repair. Civilians, millions of them, were now refugees on their own soil. Entire columns of women and children moved westward, fleeing from the advancing Soviets. Rumors spread faster than official orders. Stories of revenge, retribution, and atrocities committed in the East. But even as the front lines disintegrated, Adolf Hitler refused to acknowledge defeat. From his underground Führer bunker beneath the Chancellery in Berlin, he issued orders to imaginary armies, divisions that no longer existed. His generals, once proud strategists, now operated in fear rather than reason. In conferences filled with shouting, Hitler demanded counterattacks from units that had been annihilated weeks earlier. The German High Command tried to maintain structure. General Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel attempted to coordinate resistance on paper, but the ink itself was meaningless. Communication lines were cut, supplies were gone, and morale was broken. The once feared Wehrmacht now fought in fragmented groups, defending crossroads, small towns, and ruins. Still, propaganda continued to pour through the airwaves. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, delivered fiery speeches about miracle weapons and unshakable faith. He invoked the ghosts of Frederick the Great and the Prussian spirit. Yet even Goebbels' words, once sharp and hypnotic, now sounded like echoes in an empty hall. To the German people, the war was no longer about victory, it was about survival. In East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, entire regions were being erased from the map. The Soviet advance left cities like Königsberg and Breslau in ashes. For the first time, the Germans themselves experienced what they had inflicted on others: total war on their own soil. By March 1945, the Soviet artillery could already be heard from the outskirts of Berlin. The city that once celebrated triumphal parades was now digging trenches in its parks and gardens. The Volkssturm, a desperate militia of old men and teenage boys, was armed with whatever weapons could be found: rifles from World War I, captured Soviet carbines, even Panzerfausts salvaged from destroyed tanks. But Berlin was not ready. It was doomed. Within the bunker, Hitler clung to one final illusion: that Berlin would be held until he could negotiate peace with the Western Allies. He still believed, against all reason, that Winston Churchill and the British would side with him against the Soviets. It was delusion born from isolation and fear. Every passing day brought the front lines closer. The radio operators in Berlin, the same ones who would later send that final transmission, began losing contact with their counterparts in the field. Each coded message came back unanswered. Static grew louder than words, and yet amid the crumbling walls of command, the Reich still sent orders, still declared promotions, still imagined armies marching across maps that no longer mattered. The empire was burning from within, and the fire was moving fast. By April 1945, Berlin had become a city of ghosts. The capital of the Third Reich, once the heart of Hitler's empire, was now an island of ruin surrounded by the Red Army. What had begun as the center of conquest had turned into the last fortress of denial. Streets once filled with parades were now clogged with debris and barricades. The smell of smoke, oil, and decay hung thick in the air. In the final weeks, every able-bodied person was drafted into the city's defense. The Volkssturm, a militia of old men and boys, wore mismatched uniforms and carried outdated weapons. Many had never fired a gun before. They fought alongside the remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS divisions, and even members of the Hitler Youth, too. Berlin's military command was under General Helmuth Weidling, a disciplined officer who understood the futility of their position. Yet he followed orders. Inside his command post, he tried to organize sectors, coordinate artillery fire, and preserve some semblance of control. But the city was collapsing faster than any map could describe. The Soviets, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov from the north and Marshal Ivan Konev from the south, were racing toward the capital. Stalin had promised victory to both, creating a deadly competition between two of his most powerful generals. Between them, over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces encircled Berlin. The sky itself roared with their bombardment. Inside the Führer bunker, reality had lost all shape. Hidden beneath 12 meters of concrete and steel, Hitler's underground world was a dim labyrinth of narrow corridors, stale air, and sleepless faces. The walls shook constantly from Soviet shelling. Typewriters clicked endlessly, taking down orders that would never be fulfilled. Hitler's health had deteriorated sharply. His left hand trembled uncontrollably. His complexion was pale, his energy drained. He ranted about betrayal, by generals, by the SS, by the German people themselves. He spoke of armies that didn't exist: Army Group Steiner, Army Group Vistula, commanding phantom divisions to counterattack. Even his closest aides, including Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, knew the truth, but dared not say it aloud. Every day, reports grew worse. Communications officers intercepted frantic calls from the front lines, entire units surrendering or vanishing. Radios sputtered with incomplete messages, half-codes, distorted voices, static. The once sophisticated German Signal Corps, which had coordinated campaigns from Warsaw to Stalingrad, was now fighting for survival within Berlin's ruins. Despite the chaos, Goebbels continued to broadcast from the Reich Broadcasting House. His speeches echoed across empty streets, calls for sacrifice, faith, and loyalty to the Führer. But few were listening. Electricity was failing. Transmitters were being hit by shells. What had once been the voice of the Reich was now a flicker in the noise of destruction. Meanwhile, the Soviets advanced methodically. Their infantry fought block by block, building by building. Artillery flattened everything ahead of them. Tanks rolled through the rubble like predators in a mechanical jungle. Every intersection was a fortress, every basement a bunker. The battle for Berlin became one of the most brutal urban fights in modern history. In the midst of this siege, Berlin's civilians endured unimaginable horror. Families hid in cellars without light or food. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. The once grand avenues of Unter den Linden and Wilhelmstrasse were now trenches of stone and fire. The city's heart, its government quarter, became a cage. By April 25th, the encirclement was complete. Berlin was cut off from the outside world. No reinforcements, no supply lines, no hope. It was only a matter of time. Still, inside the bunker, the radio operators continued their work. Among them were young men from the Führer Commando and remnants of the Reichspost's communication division. They tapped out reports to the few commands still responding. Some believed the Führer's orders might change the tide. Others simply obeyed because there was nothing else left to do. As April turned to May, the sound of Soviet artillery never ceased. Dust fell from the bunker ceiling with each blast. Above them, the Reichstag burned, its dome collapsing under shell fire. Goebbels' voice faltered for the last time on the radio. Outside, Soviet soldiers raised the red banner of victory over the ruins. Inside, one final order was given: transmit the status of Berlin's defenses. One last time. The operator pressed his trembling hand on the transmitter key. His eyes stared into the red glow of the dial. He knew the message would be his last. The human angle, in the final days of April 1945, Berlin was not a city. It was a wound. Its people lived beneath the earth, buried in subway tunnels, air raid shelters, and shattered basements. Every sound carried the same message: the end was coming. Mothers held their children close, trying to muffle their cries as shells struck above. The air reeked of smoke, damp concrete, and death. Civilians moved like shadows between collapsed buildings, clutching bundles of bread, documents, and fading hope. For the German soldiers still fighting, exhaustion was beyond human measure. Many had not slept in days. They fought not for ideology anymore, but for survival, or for those still trapped behind them. Teenage members of the Hitler Youth, some, no older than 14, manned anti-tank guns on street corners. Elderly Volkssturm men, their faces carved by age and fear, reloaded rifles with trembling fingers. Yet even in despair, there were moments of humanity. A Soviet medic shared water with a captured German boy. A mother waved a white sheet from a broken window, praying the advancing troops would spare her family. In this chaos, the distinctions between soldier and civilian, victory and defeat, blurred into one long night of suffering. Those who survived would never forget the silence between bombardments, the heavy pause when all that could be heard was the distant rumble of tanks and the hiss of burning stone. That silence was the breath before history changed forever. The tactical angle on the surface, the Battle of Berlin, was chaos. But beneath the noise lay one of the most complex urban operations in history. The Soviet strategy, shaped by months of brutal experience, aimed to crush Berlin swiftly, regardless of cost. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, launched his assault from the north and east. Marshal Ivan Konev, leading the 1st Ukrainian Front, attacked from the south. Stalin's directive was simple and ruthless: reach the Reich Chancellery first. It was both a military objective and a political trophy. The Soviets concentrated more than 40,000 artillery guns around Berlin, creating a ring of fire that bombarded the city day and night. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the first shells landed in the government district. From that moment on, the bombardment never stopped. Every block was contested. The Red Army advanced using infantry supported by T-34 and IS-2 tanks, while engineers cleared mines and booby traps. German forces turned every street into a fortress. Snipers on rooftops, machine guns in basements, tank traps across intersections. The result was one of the bloodiest urban battles of the century. For the defenders, command and control had collapsed. General Weidling tried to maintain order, dividing Berlin into sectors, A, B, C, and D, but Soviet advances made such lines meaningless within hours. Communication between units relied on runners, field telephones, and increasingly unreliable radios. Entire battalions vanished in the fog of war. Still, German resistance was fierce. In some districts, SS units fought to the last man. Elsewhere, Wehrmacht soldiers surrendered as soon as Soviet forces appeared. The defenders' determination varied street by street, hour by hour. The tactical map of Berlin changed faster than any general could comprehend. The Soviets paid dearly for every meter. It took days to capture single intersections. Apartment buildings were cleared room by room. In many cases, entire regiments were reduced to a handful of survivors. But momentum was unstoppable. Zhukov's artillery pounded the government quarter while Konev's tanks smashed through Tempelhof and Tiergarten. By April 29th, Soviet forward elements could already see the spire of the Reichstag. The last stand of the German capital was underway. The technological angle in an age defined by machines and steel. It was communication, not weaponry, that carried the war's final heartbeat. By late April, German radio operations were reduced to a skeleton network. The once vast OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht communication structure had disintegrated. What remained were a few surviving transmitters deep inside Berlin, manned by exhausted operators who worked under constant bombardment. Each room was lit by the dim glow of vacuum tubes and signal lamps. Power was intermittent. Generators roared in the bunkers below. The air was thick with heat and the smell of ozone from burning wires. For years, radio had been Germany's voice of control. The way Hitler's speeches reached millions, the tool that coordinated blitzkrieg. Now it was reduced to fragments of Morse code, requests for ammunition, final reports from collapsing divisions, pleas for medical aid. The Soviets, on the other hand, used their communication superiority to devastating effect. Mobile radio. Units moved with tank columns, allowing real-time coordination across streets and districts. Artillery was guided by radio spotters positioned in captured buildings. The Red Army's logistical backbone, often overlooked, was one of the keys to its victory in Berlin. For the German Signal Corps, isolation became total. As Soviet forces advanced, lines were cut faster than they could be repaired. Messages that once traveled through secure networks now relied on luck and static. Many transmissions went unanswered, their recipients already dead or captured. Among these operators were men trained in Enigma-based cipher systems, now useless against an enemy at their doorstep. Some destroyed code books to prevent capture. Others stayed at their posts until the very end. One by one, transmitters fell silent, and yet a few continued, stubbornly, hopelessly. They tapped out their final signals from beneath the ground, through cables trembling under the weight of rubble. It was through one such transmitter that the final German message would soon echo. A voice carried through dying circuits, whispering the last words of a broken empire. They're already in the city. The leadership in Berlin's final days was not command, it was collapse. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler's world had shrunk to a few damp rooms. His armies were gone, his allies defeated. Yet he continued to issue orders as if the map before him still mattered. His trembling hand hovered over pins marking divisions that no longer existed. To the very end, he refused to believe the Soviets were already inside the city. In his final conferences, he raged at his generals, blaming them for cowardice and betrayal. He demanded that Army Group Steiner, a force of less than 10,000 men, with no tanks or supplies, counterattack north of Berlin to rescue the city. When that failed, his fury turned inward. He accused the German people of failing him, of being unworthy of victory. Beside him, Joseph Goebbels remained loyal beyond reason. The propaganda minister's devotion bordered on madness. While Hitler, obsessed over maps, Goebbels prepared his own family for death. His wife, Magda, wrote farewell letters and dressed their 6 children in white. They would not live in a world without National Socialism, she said. General Helmuth Weidling, commanding the defense of Berlin, faced the impossible. A professional soldier and realist, he knew the city could not hold. Yet every attempt to negotiate surrender risked execution. When he entered the Führer bunker on April 29th, expecting to be arrested for retreating, Hitler instead appointed him commander of all forces in Berlin. His orders: defend the capital to the last man. Outside, General Hans Krebs, Hitler's chief of staff, tried to maintain communication with surviving field commands. His reports became shorter and bleaker with each passing hour. There were no reserves, no fuel, no ammunition, only ruins. In the final hours, leadership became silence. Orders ceased. Meetings turned into whispered farewells. Hitler retreated to his private room, wrote his will, and on April 30th, 1945, ended his life with a pistol. The empire he built on control dissolved in the sound of a single gunshot. The enemy angle for the Soviet Union, the fall of Berlin, was not just a victory, it was vengeance. From the fields of Stalingrad to the ruins of Kursk and Smolensk, millions of Soviet soldiers had died pushing the Germans back. The Red Army entered Berlin carrying the weight of 4 years of unimaginable loss. Marshal Georgy Zhukov led his men with brutal efficiency. His artillery turned entire districts into dust before advancing. To his south, Marshal Ivan Konev drove through the suburbs, racing to be the first to seize the Reichstag. Both men knew that whoever captured Berlin would secure not only Stalin's favor, but a permanent place in Soviet history. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front assaulted the city head-on from the east, through Silo Heights, a blood-soaked ridge defended by desperate German troops. The battle there cost over 30,000 Soviet lives, but it opened the road to Berlin. Once inside the city, Soviet units fought block by block, using flamethrowers, grenades, and machine guns in close combat. Every street became a battlefield of echoes and screams. The Soviet soldiers who entered Berlin were a mixture of hardened veterans and young recruits. Many had seen their villages burned, their families killed by the German invasion. To them, this was not merely conquesting, it was retribution. Discipline often faltered. Looting and atrocities followed the chaos of victory, a dark stain on the triumph that would echo for decades. Yet amid the vengeance, there was also awe. Soviet troops walked through the shattered avenues of a city that had once seemed invincible. They found Hitler's grand architecture reduced to rubble, the marble corridors buried in ash. In their minds, this was justice, history's final correction. When the red banner was raised over the Reichstag on May 2, 1945, it symbolized not just the fall of Berlin, but the culmination of the Soviet Union's suffering and endurance, the moral angle. No victory in war comes without its shadow, and the Battle of Berlin was one of the darkest. The city had become a moral void. Ideologies, loyalties, and humanity itself were buried under the rubble. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised a 1,000-year empire. Now its remnants lay burning in streets lined with the dead. In the last days, the myth of invincibility shattered completely. Even the most loyal party members faced a truth they could no longer deny. The Reich was gone. The slogans painted on the walls, victory or death, now mocked the people beneath them. Inside the bunker, suicide became the final act of loyalty. Hitler's staff followed him one by one. Goebbels poisoned his children before taking his own life. Officers shot themselves beside radios that no longer functioned. Outside, some soldiers chose surrender. Others walked into Soviet fire rather than live in defeat. For civilians, the moral collapse was even more profound. Years of indoctrination had told them to fear the enemy beyond comprehension. Many took their own lives rather than face the Red Army. Others, freed from the regime's grip, began to question everything they had believed. In the ruins of Berlin, the idea of good and evil blurred into survival. Soldiers and civilians, victors and vanquished, all were caught in the machinery of a war that had devoured the world. When that final German transmission went out, "They're already in the city," it carried more than information. It was confession. It was acceptance. The voice that spoke those words didn't just report defeat. It declared the end of a belief that had consumed millions. The words marked the point where ideology died, and history began to reclaim the truth. The radio static that followed wasn't silence. It was the sound of an empire dissolving. The walls of the Führer bunker trembled under the constant roar of Soviet artillery. It was April 29, 1945, and the war's final act was unfolding in real time beneath the streets of Berlin. The city above was gone, reduced to gray dust and twisted iron. Yet, deep underground, typewriters still clattered, phones still rang, and exhausted men still waited for orders that no longer had meaning. Inside the dimly lit corridors, the air was thick with smoke and sweat. Power flickered. Candles burned in jars on tables once reserved for generals and ministers. Every face reflected the same truth. The end was not approaching. It was already here. Hitler spent his final hours in a detached calm that bordered on the unreal. His once commanding voice had faded into a monotone murmur. Between coughing fits, he dictated his last political testament. It was part confession, part accusation. He blamed the generals for cowardice, the SS for failure, and the German people for their supposed weakness. Yet in every word, the denial remained intact. In another room, Joseph Goebbels and his wife prepared their children for what was to come. The little ones were told they would soon see a better Germany. Their eyes were too young to understand. At 3:30 a.m., news arrived that shattered even the bunker's fragile illusions. Benito Mussolini had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. His body had been hung upside down in a Milan square. The message was clear. This was how dictators died. Hitler's reaction was chillingly calm. He nodded and said only, "So ends a traitor." Then he turned to his adjutant and ordered preparations for his own death. Above ground, the Soviets were tightening the noose. Marshal Zhukov's 8th Guards Army and Konev's 3rd Guards Tank Army were closing in from both sides. The Reichstag was now within range of direct artillery fire. Soviet spotters on rooftops could already see the Brandenburg Gate through the haze. In the bunker's communications room, the operators still tapped their keys, sending out fragmentary messages to units that no longer existed. Most of the signals returned unanswered. Others came back as bursts of static, the sound of annihilation. One message from a forward defense post near Potsdamer Platz simply read, "Out of ammunition. Enemy tanks 100 meters. Request permission to retreat." No reply came. As dawn broke over April 30th, Soviet tanks reached the Tiergarten. The Reich Chancellery was now surrounded. The battle raged only a few hundred meters away from Hitler's bunker. The smell of gunpowder and dust seeped through the ventilation shafts. At 10 a.m., Hitler called his inner circle for a final meeting. Around him stood Goebbels, Bormann, Krebs, and a handful of aides. His face was gray, his eyes hollow. There was no longer a trace of the orator who had once hypnotized nations. He announced that he would not leave Berlin. His words were calm. "I will not fall into the hands of the enemy. The war is lost." He dismissed them with a nod. Shortly after 3 p.m., he withdrew to his private quarters with Eva Braun, who had married him less than 40 hours earlier. The staff heard the sound of a door closing. Minutes later, a single gunshot. When aides entered, Hitler was slumped on the sofa. A pistol lay in his hand. Eva Braun was beside him, dead from poison. The end that millions had fought and died for had lasted less than a second. The bodies were carried up to the Chancellery garden, soaked in gasoline, and burned under the open sky as shells exploded nearby. The flames rose briefly, then faded. Soviet troops, unaware of what had just happened, were already within a few blocks. In the bunker, Joseph Goebbels assumed temporary control of the government, what little of it remained. He ordered one last communiqué to be transmitted to all remaining forces. "The Führer is dead. Continue the struggle." But the words carried no power. The men receiving them were scattered, leaderless, and exhausted. Some still fought on instinct. Others laid down their arms and surrendered to the Soviets. By nightfall, only a handful of buildings in the city center remained under German control. The Reichstag burned like a torch against the darkened sky. Soviet soldiers advanced through smoke and ruin, raising their rifles in exhausted triumph. In the bunker, Goebbels prepared for his own end. His wife, after poisoning their children, sat beside him in silence. At 8 p.m., the couple walked out into the courtyard and ended their lives. The air smelled of death and gasoline, and below, the last functioning German radio operator kept tapping out messages, not for victory, not even for hope, but for history, because somewhere in the collapsing ruins above, the final transmission was about to be sent, a voice trembling through static. They're already in the city. Above the buried bunker, Berlin's final heartbeat echoed through shattered streets. It was May 1st, 1945, the day after Hitler's death, and yet, the fighting did not stop. In the ruins of the Reichstag, Soviet soldiers from Lieutenant Alexei Berest's and Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov's units raised the red banner of victory on its roof. The flag flapped through smoke and gunfire, visible for only seconds at a time as the wind carried black ash across the skyline. For the Soviet troops, it was the symbol of total triumph, the fall of the empire that had once invaded their homeland. But deep underground, below the chaos, the men still operating the German communication posts refused to stop. They were radio men, trained to obey until the signal went dead. Their equipment was battered. Vacuum tubes cracked from shockwaves, cables scorched, power failing. The operator leaned close to the microphone, his face lit by a dim orange lamp. The radio hummed with the rhythm of destruction. Through the static came faint voices, distant commands, some pleading, others defiant. Most were fragments, request support. Sector D lost. Artillery silent. He turned a dial, seeking a clear frequency. There was nothing. Then faintly, the call sign of the Reich Chancellery Communications Office came through. The voice was calm but strained. Confirm position. Enemy proximity? The operator swallowed hard, pressed the transmit button, and answered. They're already in the city. For a moment there was silence, a heavy, metallic silence that seemed to fill the entire bunker. Those words were not just a report. They were a eulogy. Outside, Soviet troops had reached the Wilhelmstrasse, less than 200 meters from the Chancellery. Tanks fired at point-blank range into the government district. The explosions shook the bunker walls. Dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow. In the communications room, the operators continued to transmit, as if persistence alone could hold back reality. Messages went out to General Weidling, to surviving SS units, to phantom divisions that had ceased to exist. None replied. By late evening, Soviet loudspeakers echoed through the streets above, demanding surrender. They promised food, safety, and medical aid to any who laid down their arms. Some German soldiers wept. Others continued to fight, firing until their weapons jammed or ran empty. At 4 a.m., General Weidling, having received reports that ammunition was nearly gone, made the decision that would end it all. He drafted an order for unconditional surrender of all German forces in Berlin. The document, handwritten and brief, was carried through enemy lines under a white flag, but the radios still whispered. In one corner of the communications bunker, an engineer tried to keep the last transmitter running. He connected wires by hand, replacing blown fuses with scavenged metal. He wasn't doing it for victory anymore. He was doing it because silence meant the world had ended. When the Soviet soldiers finally stormed the Chancellery complex, the resistance they encountered was sporadic. Bursts of gunfire, isolated snipers and pockets of fanatical SS troops. Most defenders had either surrendered or fled into the subway tunnels. The Reich Chancellery garden, once manicured and pristine, was now a graveyard of twisted metal. Soviet officers searched the smoking ruins and found the charred remains of bodies believed to be Hitler and Braun. Their discovery marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime. In the command bunker below, Weidling received Soviet emissaries and agreed to meet at General Chukhov's headquarters. The final ceasefire was arranged for May 2, 1945. At 7 a.m., the order went out over every surviving German frequency. Ceasefire. The battle for Berlin is over. Across the city, the gunfire faded. The operator who had sent the last desperate transmission sat in silence. The room around him was filled with smoke, cables, and the soft crackle of dead frequencies. He wrote one final note in his logbook. No further contact. Then he powered down the transmitter. The light on the console dimmed, flickered, and went out. For 6 years, that light had carried the voice of a regime. Across Europe, across oceans, across the world. Now it was gone. Above, Soviet soldiers lowered their weapons. Some lit cigarettes and stared at the sky where dawn was breaking through the haze. Berlin lay in ruins, silent except for the distant rumble of collapsing buildings and the soft hiss of fires dying in the streets. The war that had begun with a broadcast, Hitler's voice on the radio in 1939 announcing the invasion of Poland, had ended with another broadcast, one of surrender and silence. From the first command to attack to the last whisper of defeat, the radio had been the heartbeat of the Reich, and now that heartbeat had stopped. The message, "They're already in the city," was more than information. It was the sound of the 20th century closing one of its darkest chapters. The war in Europe was over, but its echoes would carry through the static of history forever. When the guns finally fell silent on the morning of May 2, 1945, Berlin no longer resembled a city. It was a scar, a skeletal monument to total war. The Battle of Berlin had lasted just over 2 weeks, but in that time, it had consumed everything. More than 80,000 Soviet soldiers lay dead or wounded. The Germans had lost over 90,000, with tens of thousands more civilians caught in the inferno. The final act of the European war had cost more lives than many entire campaigns before it. At 7:45 a.m., General Helmuth Weidling, weary and gray-faced, arrived at Marshal Vasily Chwykov's command post in the district of Tempelhof. There, surrounded by Soviet officers and interpreters, he signed the official order of surrender. His voice was quiet when he spoke the words confirming Berlin's capitulation. The city is defenseless. The fighting has ceased. Moments later, Soviet loudspeakers broadcast the announcement across the ruins in German and Russian. "Comrades, the German garrison has capitulated. Lay down your arms." The war's final echo rippled through the streets, not the crash of artillery but the soft clatter of rifles hitting the ground. Soviet troops began fanning through the city. They found pockets of German soldiers emerging from basements and tunnels, their hands raised. Some wept openly. Others stared blankly, unable to comprehend that the empire for which they had fought had ceased to exist. In the bunker complex, silence reigned. The smell of fuel and death still lingered in the corridors. Soviet search teams descended through the wreckage of the chancellery and found the remains of Goebbels, his wife, and their children. Nearby lay the ashes of Hitler and Eva Braun, burned beyond recognition yet instantly understood. The Red Army declared victory. Above the ruins, a forest of red flags appeared. Over the Reichstag, over the Brandenburg Gate, over the radio towers that once carried the Führer's voice across Europe. Loudspeakers played the Soviet anthem while artillery saluted in the distance. But beneath the celebration was an overwhelming stillness. The last German transmission had faded into silence the night before, and with it, the sound of the Reich vanished from the airwaves. Allied monitoring stations in London and Moscow confirmed it. The once dominant network of German military communications, the same network that had orchestrated the Blitz, the invasions of France, Poland, and the Soviet Union, had gone completely dark. For the first time since 1939, Europe listened to peace, yet peace did not mean relief. The human cost was unimaginable. Berlin's civilians, nearly 3 million before the war, were reduced to half that number. Many were homeless, wounded, or starving. The streets were lined with makeshift graves marked by wooden planks. Water and food were scarce. Disease spread quickly through the ruins. The Soviets moved swiftly to secure control. German prisoners were rounded up and marched eastward. Engineers began clearing mines, restoring electricity, and establishing order in what was now the Soviet sector. For many Berliners, the Red Army represented both liberation and occupation, salvation from the Nazis, but the beginning of a new kind of fear. Foreign journalists arriving days later described a city that looked as if the earth itself had swallowed civilization. Buildings stood without walls. Streets disappeared into craters. Even the trees in Tiergarten were shattered, their trunks splintered by shell fire. And somewhere amid that devastation, a radio operator's chair remained empty, his transmitter silent. No one knew his name. No one knew where he fell. But his final words, carried across the collapsing frequencies of the Reich, had become the last heartbeat of Nazi Germany. "They're already in the city." That message, once routine, now eternal, had marked the exact moment the Third Reich ceased to exist. The world had entered a new silence. The war's end did not bring clarity, only a shifting kind of silence. In the smoldering remains of Berlin, the victors now turned to the work of dismantling what was left of the Third Reich and dividing the carcass of an empire that had once sought to rule the world. The surrender of Berlin was only the first step. Within a week, on May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Reims, France, before the Allied Supreme Command. And a day later, on May 8th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel ratified it again in Karlshorst, on the outskirts of Berlin, in front of Soviet generals. That day would be remembered as Victory in Europe Day, V-Day. But even as the celebrations erupted across London, Moscow, and New York, Berlin itself was too broken to rejoice. The people there did not celebrate. They simply endured. The once mighty network that had kept Hitler's armies coordinated, the vast radio and telegraph infrastructure of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, lay in ruins. Allied signal units entered what remained of Germany's communications hubs and found rooms filled with melted cables, shattered transmitters, and half-burned cipher books. The Reich's voice, once broadcast in every corner of occupied Europe, had been silenced not by censorship but by total destruction. The Allies, however, listened carefully to that silence. In the days following the surrender, British and American intelligence teams scoured Germany for radio logs, transmission records, and cryptographic devices. They sought to understand how an empire that had once used radio as a weapon of unity and propaganda had ended its life through that same medium, a dying whisper in static. The final transmission, "They're already in the city," was confirmed by multiple intercept stations, both Soviet and Allied. It became, in time, a symbolic moment, the instant when technological mastery met human futility. Berlin itself was divided soon after into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, American, British, and French. The borders cut through neighborhoods, streets, and families. The city was not rebuilt overnight. It was partitioned, politically and spiritually. In the Soviet sector, red flags hung from every surviving building. Statues of Lenin were erected beside the ruins of Nazi monuments. Soviet administrators took control of the press, police, and utilities. The old Reich broadcasting house from which Goebbels had once delivered his propaganda was seized and transformed into Radio Berlin, a new voice carrying Soviet-approved messages of reconstruction and socialism. In the western sectors, the British and Americans began their own broadcasts, RIAS, radio in the American sector, speaking directly to Berliners with news of relief efforts, democracy, and the beginnings of what they called re-education. The airwaves that had once united a dictatorship now became the front lines of a new ideological war. And so, even as the rubble was cleared and the dead buried, the battle for the future began, a war of words, signals, and frequencies that would define the next half-century. The psychological scars, however, lingered. The German people were forced to confront not only defeat but complicity. The images of concentration camps liberated by the Allies circulated through newspapers and newsreels. For many, it was the first time they saw what their silence and obedience had enabled. Historians would later describe the final radio transmission not merely as a military message, but as a moment of moral reckoning, the sound of a nation hearing itself collapse. The man who spoke those words remains unknown, but his voice became immortal. In the months that followed, Berlin's ruins were gradually cleared. Soviet and Allied photographers documented every corner, every burned-out tank, every shattered monument. The Reichstag, once the symbol of power, stood hollow and blackened, its walls still scarred by bullet holes that remain to this day. The airwaves that had carried the empire's ambitions now carried news of trials, the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders faced justice for crimes beyond comprehension. The microphones that had once served propaganda now recorded testimony. From the static of that final night emerged a new world order, one defined not by conquest but by remembrance and division. The war in Europe had ended, but the silence that followed, the silence after the last transmission, was not peace. It was the beginning of the Cold War. There are moments in history when entire civilizations collapse into a single sound. For Nazi Germany, that sound was not the roar of tanks or the blast of artillery. It was the fragile hum of a dying radio. "They're already in the city." 6 words carried by static and fear, marking the end of a regime that once promised eternity. In that instant, all the speeches, the parades, the banners, and the terror reduced themselves to a single truth: nothing built on delusion can last. The transmission did more than announce a military defeat. It announced the end of an idea, that one nation could dominate the world through will, obedience, and violence. It was the voice of realization itself, spoken by a man who likely knew he would not live to see the dawn. And yet through that despair there was something deeply human. The message was not shouted. It was not defiant. It was calm, resigned. It carried the tone of someone who had seen the impossible finally become inevitable. In that moment, technology, the same medium that had once unified millions in belief, became the instrument of final confession. The radio that had spread propaganda now transmitted truth. The empire that had risen on its own voice was buried beneath its echo. When the airwaves went silent, the world exhaled. For the first time in 6 years, the frequency of war ceased. But silence does not erase memory, it preserves it. The ruins of Berlin, the bullet scars on the Reichstag, the tapes of intercepted messages, all remain as reminders of what happens when power forgets humanity. That final transmission was not just a military signal. It was the end of an age, a voice carried through dust and destruction, whispering the truth that every empire must one day face. No wall, no army, no ideology stands forever. The radio operator's words still drift through history's static, a warning, a requiem, and a reminder. They're already in the city, and with that the century changed.